In this video, we're going to talk about why we raise preflop. So like I mentioned in the section introduction, this section is going to be covering open raising, commonly referred to as either raising first into the pot or putting the preflop raise into the pot. So rather than just show you ranges and show you different sizes that you should be using, I want you to understand why we raise preflop, because in regards to the goal of becoming a thinking poker player, you need to understand why you're doing something rather than just taking a poker coach's word for what they say and be like, okay, well, Outland says I need to raise this range and I need to raise this sizing. Well, I want you to understand why we raise. So that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to cover in this video. Now, just so you understand, I want to make sure when we talk about a preflop raise or open raising or raising first into the pot, what this is, and let me go ahead and highlight this bullet point because this is important. I want you to understand this fully, is that this occurs when no one else has yet to raise preflop. So when you're the first person to voluntarily commit chips to the pot via raise, that's what an open raise is, or raising first into the pot, or preflop raise. Okay, so with that said, I want to talk about 5 specific reasons why we raise rather than limp. And those reasons are these right here: showing strength, gaining the initiative, thinning the field, building the pot with good hands, and stealing the blinds. And we're going to spend some time going over each of these. So let's start off talking about the first one, which is showing strength. So this one is pretty straightforward, just like its name implies. So we raise preflop to show strength. So a preflop raise signals strength, whereas limping signals weakness. And let me go ahead and highlight that because that's important, right? If you're at a poker table and somebody open limps from under the gun, they're not showing strength, they're showing weakness. Whereas if somebody open raises first act and they're showing strength. What we're doing when we raise is that we're telling our opponents that we have a strong hand and we're not afraid to put money into the pot with this hand. So we're not afraid to raise, whereas a limping type of opponent, well, they're playing a weak style of poker. They're afraid to put in raise. They'd rather take a more risk adverse strategy and limp rather than raise. So that's showing strength. I mean, pretty straightforward, pretty basic. Really don't need to go into much more detail regarding this. Just understand that we raise to show strength, to put fear into the minds of our opponents. Whereas when we limp, we're not putting fear into the minds of our opponents. We're signaling strong opponents to attack our weakness. All right, so that's the first one. The second one we want to talk about is we raise to gain the initiative. And so we're not only showing strength, but when we raise, we also gain the initiative in the hand. So what we're doing is when we're raising, we're showing strength, we're gaining that initiative to drive the action in the hand. So what'll happen is that when we raise, we show strength. In our opponent's eyes, we have a strong uncapped range, and they'll look to us to drive the action post-flop. So it's not uncommon for you to hear check to the raiser in a live poker game. And when people are signaling that, they are signaling to us as a preflop raiser to drive the action in the game because we have the initiative by raising rather than limping. When it's a limped pot and everybody limps, nobody has the initiative. Nobody is driving the action. The first person to act post-flopped in a limp pot is then going to gain the initiative. But in a pot that's raised pre-flopped, whether it's a single raise pot, which is what we're talking about now in this section, or later when we talk about 3-bet pots or when we talk about isolation raises, the person that puts in that final raise is going to have the initiative in the hand. So what this is when they signal this all check to the raiser, or when you're playing online where they just simply check and then wait for the raiser to act, what they're doing is they're respecting you as a pre-flop raiser. Because, and let me go ahead and highlight this because it's important, they respect the preflop raiser because they know that you have a strong uncapped range. So remember, getting back to a previous lecture, when somebody is calling or limping, they have a capped range that can't have the strongest hands. But we, as a raiser, our range is uncapped all the way up to pocket aces. So that's an important point to understand, that the callers are going to have a weaker capped range. So having the initiative in poker is a great thing. It's especially important when we're in position, and we'll see this when we start playing post-flop with our post-flop section. So when we have the initiative and we're in position, we can better dictate the flow of the hand against our weaker, more passive opponents, because they're going to look to us to see what we do before they determine what they're going to do. So one additional thing with gaining the initiative is we also capitalize on what's called dead money. So when our opponents don't have the initiative, they're not really fighting for the money. And so that money that's in the middle of the pot, we typically call that dead money. So money is sitting in the middle of the pot that players aren't aggressively fighting for, that's dead money. So in a hand where everybody is just limping, whether it's open limping and then several people over limp, if we put an ISO raise, we're looking to attack that dead money, because by limping, they're not really looking to take down that money. Versus when somebody pre-flop raises and it folds around to the blinds, they have a tough decision: either play out of position and fight for the blinds or just give it up. So when we're looking to raise and take the initiative, we're also looking to take down this dead money, something that callers and weak passive type of opponents aren't willing to do. All right, so that's the second one. The third one is we thin the field, and this is really important. And we're going to spend a couple of slides talking about thinning the field, because I want you to understand why this is so important. And a lot of beginning poker players really don't understand why thinning the field is so important. And for a lot of them, it's somewhat counterintuitive. They think, I have a good hand, I want to play against multiple opponents. But in all reality, from a mathematical perspective, we don't. And you'll see why on the next slide. So by raising, we also limit our competition, which is a good thing. And the reason for that, without getting into the mathematics yet, is that the more players are in the hand, the harder it is to win, because our equity declines, meaning our probability of winning that hand declines. So, of course, when our equity declines, then so does something that's called the expected value of our hand. So remember, plus EV versus minus EV, we want to strive for positive expected value plays, and we want to stay away from negative expected value plays. And in certain instances, there are going to be multiple different options with a particular hand, and we want to choose the one that has the highest positive expected value. And I'm going to show you what I mean exactly on the next slide. So here's a very simple example of thinning the field. So let's assume that we're hero and we have ace queen offsuit, and our opponents are calling our 3 big blind raise with a 23.53% range of hands. And I put this together in Equilab, and we'll do a live demonstration of Equilab later in this section to show you how you can visualize ranges and save them after I share the ranges that I think you should be using as your baseline set of pre-flop raising ranges. But this is what it's going to look like. Pocket deuces up to jacks, ace king or ace queen suited down to ace deuce suited, king 9 suited plus, queen 9 suited plus, jack 9 suited plus, 10 9 suited, ace 6 off plus, king 10 off plus, etc., excluding the strongest hands that we would typically 3-bet. So our hand ace queen versus a fairly wide range of hands. What I did is I plugged this information into Equilab, which again I'll demonstrate later in this section, and I'll also be using throughout this course. So it's definitely something that you're going to want to utilize if you don't already. And I use something that is called a basic EV calculation. I believe I'm not going to cover that later in this course. I saved that for my poker math course. It's kind of beyond the scope of what you need to know in this course, and I don't want to muddle this course with too much poker mathematics. But I use a basic EV calculation, and I plugged all this information into Equilab as well. And what I did is I did it against 1 opponent, 2 opponents, 3 opponents, 4 opponents, or 5 opponents. And this is a 6 max table. So this would be what we would call a family pot. A family pot is where everybody enters the hand and plays. And so what I calculated from this was our equity, our probability of winning the hand, and our EV, how much we expect to win in the long run in that situation. And so what you're going to notice is that as more opponents enter the hand, our equity declines. So with ace queen against 1 opponent with a 23.53% range of hands, we are 61.58% favored. And by the time we get all the way down to 5 opponents, we're no longer a favorite. We only our probability of winning the hand is 17.91% of the time. So it declines all the way from the top down to the bottom. Now, in terms of the EV, what's interesting is that from 1 opponent down to 3 opponents, it starts to decline, but from 1 to 2, it actually goes up slightly. But then by the time we get to 3, 4, and 5, it declines. And by the time that we get down to 5 opponents, the long-term expected profitability of this play is 0.69 big blinds, all the way down to 0.22 big blinds. And I believe what I did with this is I looked at the amount of money that we're putting in is 3 big blinds from us and 3 big blinds from our opponents. So when you see this very small amount, we're looking at just putting in against us and our opponent a total of 6 big blinds. With a total of 6 opponents, it would be 18 big blinds. So it's not looking at 100 big blinds put in from us and 100 big blinds put in from our opponent. But the whole point of this is that not only does our equity decline, but looking at 1 through 5 combined, it declines, even though it goes up a little bit, and then it goes down, and drastically from 3 opponents to 4 opponents. So this is why it's so important to thin the field. And don't really need to talk about this since we already talked about this, but on the second bullet point is that there's a specific reason that this occurs, and I'll just highlight this whole bullet point. It's because every single person in the hand has a chance of winning the hand, and that's what we call their equitable share or fair share of the pot. And I'll just put another box around this down here. So because everybody in the hand has some sort of equity in the hand, their fair share portion of the pot, then of course our equity is going to decline, and of course our expected value, the profitability, is going to decline as well. And this is a concept that I coined in my book Master Micro-Stakes Poker that I hadn't seen any other poker coaches utilize. I called it the diminishing equity concept, and it states as more people enter a hand pre-flop, our probability of winning that hand declines as each player acquires an equitable fair share portion of that pot. So this is one of, I think, the biggest aha moments for a lot of players, is to understand why we thin the field, why we don't want to play against 5 opponents with pocket aces, and why we would prefer to play against 1 or 2 opponents instead. All right, so that is thinning the field. Now, the next reason that we raise, well, this one is pretty intuitive. We build the pot with good hands. So when we have a good hand, we want to build the pot, right? We don't want to make the pot as small as possible with a good hand. With a good hand, such as pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, and so forth, we want to build the pot pre-flop. And when we think we have the best hand post-flop, we want to continue to build the pot. And so what I did here is I have an example, and what I want to do is share with you is comparing open limping versus open raising and seeing the drastic difference in the size of the pot by the time we get to the river if we bet every single round. So what I did is I took a simple example of limping 1 big blind versus open raising 3 big blinds. We're playing heads up against an opponent, and on each post-flop street, we're betting a half pot size bet. So if you take a look at this, and you're going to notice that there's a 0.5 BB because we're playing against the big blind, so we're assuming that the small blind folded. And so we limped, the big blind checked because the big blind already has a blind out there. In this situation, we open raise to 3, everybody folds, goes around to the big blind calls the 3. And so what you want to look at here is we're betting a half pot size bet. Look at how much drastically the sizes of the pot is on each round. 5 big blinds versus 13, 10 big blinds versus 26, and then by the river, 20 big blinds versus 52 big blinds. So what we're able to do by raising is we're able to build the pot 2.6 times larger on the river than if we open limped and we bet a half pot size bet on each round. So this is why it's important to open raise, because if we don't open raise, then it's going to be a lot harder to build the pot. And by open raising, the expected value, the long-term profitability of our hand is going to be a lot higher than if we just simply limped. All right, so on to the last one, and we're going to talk about this in its own separate videos, possibly its own separate section where we're talking about stealing the blinds and defending against blind defense. But this is the last reason why we raise. So by the time it gets to the cutoff, the button, or the small blind, we want to look to steal those blinds in late position. And when we are looking to steal the blinds, we're typically open raising with our weaker hands in late position. And you're going to see that when I demonstrate the different ranges that you would utilize to open raise. You're going to see that it goes from smaller to much larger because stealing the blinds increases our profitability vastly over the long run in regards to playing poker. So when we are looking to open raise with our weakest hands in late position, our primary goal is to win the blinds uncontested pre-flop. And when we do this, we're capitalizing on a concept that I just introduced, capitalizing on that dead money in the pot, the 1.5 big blinds that's just sitting there for our taking that we're hoping the small blind and the big blind won't defend against. So we consider blinds dead money because they're forced bets. So when we look at them as a forced bet and we look at the small blind and the big blind, they're the last two players left to act. So the probability of them having a strong hand versus us being under the gun in the middle position, cutoff, button, small blind, and big blind also being left to act, the probability of them having a good hand goes down drastically. And also because they're forced to play out of position, it's a lot harder for them to play perfectly. So they're going to play imperfect poker or more so imperfectly compared to us because we're going to be in position. So we're hoping that they're not going to be defending optimally versus us out of position in the blinds. And that's kind of the whole reason why we look at this as dead money. And like I said, we're going to be dedicating several different videos, possibly an entire section, to stealing the blinds and blind defense later in this section, the pre-flop section of the course. So that's going to conclude this video. Let me just go back to the first slide just as a recap. So the different reasons, the 5 specific reasons why we raise is to show strength, to gain the initiative, to thin the field, vitally important concept to understand, to build the pot, again, another vitally important concept to understand, and to steal the blinds. So hopefully this was insightful for you. And like I said, I'm here to teach you why we do specific things. I just don't want to give you a robotic methodology of playing the game saying, raise these ranges, bet this much, and do X, Y, and Z. I want you to understand why. And that's going to allow you to increase your game and to move up and out of the micro stakes. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.